Nobody knows where hobbits actually came from. Not the elves, not the dwarves, not even the hobbits themselves. Their own oral history simply stops a few centuries back and goes quiet before that, like someone erased the first chapters on purpose. What we do know is this: they left their homeland running from something they never fully explained, crossed mountains that killed people twice their size, and starved through winters that wiped out entire families in a single season. By the time the survivors sat down and built something as peaceful as the Shire, most of them didn't even remember how close they'd come to not existing at all. This is that story, the one the books mention in a single paragraph and then never bring up again. Here's a strange fact to sit with for a second. Tolkien built entire genealogies for his elves, going back thousands of years before the sun existed. He tracked the bloodlines of men through generation after generation, wrote appendices listing kings nobody would ever meet on page. And then you get to hobbits, the characters the entire story is actually about, and the trail just stops. Their own memory, the record they kept of themselves, doesn't reach back far enough to say where they started. What survives is a vague tradition, a sense passed down and worn smooth by centuries of retelling that they once lived somewhere by a great river in the open lands east of the mountains. Beyond that, nothing solid, no founding myth, no first hobbit, no answer to the obvious question of what they even were before they were hobbits. That gap isn't an accident of the text. It's the whole point of what happened to them. A people don't forget their own beginning because nothing happened. They forget it because at some point, remembering stopped being useful and surviving started taking up all the room. Compare that to almost anyone else in this world. Men trace their line back to Numenor and further still. Dwarves know exactly which of the seven fathers their house descends from. Even orcs, twisted and corrupted as they were, have an origin someone bothered to argue about. Hobbits are the only major people in the entire legendarium whose own historians shrug when you ask where they started. Not because Tolkien forgot to write it down, because he built a culture that genuinely didn't know and never much cared to find out. That choice says something. A people this comfortable not knowing their own beginning had to become that way. Nobody starts out incurious about where they came from. Something has to happen first that makes the question feel less important than simply making it through the next season. Before any of that indifference set in, though, there was a stretch of time worth picturing properly, because it's the only calm chapter this story gets, and it's worth understanding exactly what got lost when it ended. Picture the Vales of Anduin in the early Third Age, wide grasslands split by the river, forest to the east thick enough to swallow the horizon, mountains to the west holding the whole valley like a bowl. Hobbits lived there in loose communities, farming, fishing the shallows, digging their burrows into soft riverbank soil. They lived close enough to the Eotheod, ancestors of the people who'd later become the Rohirrim, to pick up bits of their language, the names for the days of the week among them. They knew dwarves well enough to trade with them on the mountain roads. It was, by every account that survives, an unremarkable, comfortable life, the kind of life nobody writes down because nothing about it seems worth recording at the time. That's usually how it goes right before everything changes. Two things started happening at once, and neither one was dramatic on its own. Men were multiplying, more of them, spreading further, taking up more of the land hobbits had quietly assumed was theirs to use. And something else was shifting in the forest to the east. Nothing anyone could point to directly, no army, no declared enemy, just a kind of unease settling over Greenwood the Great that hadn't been there before. A sense that the trees themselves had started paying attention in a way they hadn't used to. Hobbits didn't write treatises about it. They didn't need to. They just stopped feeling at ease in a place they'd called home for longer than anyone could remember. And when hobbits stop feeling at ease somewhere, It turns out they do something most people wouldn't expect from a species famous for never wanting to leave its own garden. They walked. The story usually gets flattened into one sentence: the hobbits migrated west, and that sentence hides almost everything interesting about what happened. Because it wasn't one migration, it was three, separated by decades, made by three groups of hobbits who didn't necessarily think of themselves as the same people at all. The first to go were the ones later called Harfoots, by far the largest group, browner skinned, going barefoot, comfortable with tunnels and hillsides, the closest thing to what most people now picture when they hear the word hobbit. Around the year 1050 of the Third Age, they started crossing the mountains into the lands that would become Eriador. Not all at once, not as an army or an organized exodus, just families, then more families, deciding one at a time that the far side of the mountains looked safer than the near side. About a century later, the Falahidas followed. They were the smallest group by number, but they carried themselves differently, taller, fairer, more comfortable around elves than either of the other two breeds, with a taste for hunting and travel that never quite left their descendants. Where the Harfoots settled in and stayed still for generations at a time, the Falahidas kept moving, kept pushing further, and somewhere in that restlessness, they ended up doing something that would matter enormously later. They became the ones other hobbits followed. Chieftains, leaders, not because anyone voted on it, just because it turned out that's who they were. And then there were the Stoors, who did the strangest thing of all three groups. They stayed. While Harfoots and Falahides pushed west, the Stoors lingered in the south, near the Gladden fields, close to the river they'd never fully let go of. Heavier built than the other two, more comfortable in boats than burrows, more used to dealing with men because they lived closer to them, plain and simple. It took them somewhere between a full century and a century and a half longer to finally move, and when they did, they didn't take the road everyone else had taken. They went south first, through the Redhorn Pass, down toward a marshy stretch of land near Dunland, a place that at least resembled the wet, river-fed home they were leaving behind. 3 tribes, 3 timelines, 3 completely different roads out of the only home any of them had ever known. And every single one of those roads ran straight through the part of the world that didn't care how small you were. Stop and picture this for a second, because it's easy to skip past in a sentence and completely miss what it meant physically. These are people roughly half the height of a grown man. No armor, no war horses, no wizard walking beside them with a staff and a plan. Just families, children, the elderly, people carrying whatever they could fit on their backs, walking into mountains that regularly killed travelers 3 times their size. There was no clear road, no way stations, no maps drawn by anyone who'd made the crossing and lived to describe it properly. The passes that did exist were the same ones used by everyone else trying to get through the misty mountains, narrow, exposed, freezing even in what should have been the warmer months, with air thin enough at altitude to leave grown men gasping. Snow could come without warning. Rock slides didn't check who was underneath before they came down. And this was before anyone had heard the word orc used as a serious threat in these particular passes. The danger here wasn't a monster with a name. It was altitude and cold and simple bad luck, over and over, for weeks at a time. Nobody wrote a body count. That's the thing about Hobbit history. It doesn't keep the kind of records that let you know exactly how many people didn't make it across. What survives instead is just the fact of it. 3 separate groups, at 3 separate times, crossed those mountains anyway. Not because it was safe, because whatever was behind them had started to feel less safe than the unknown in front of them. Think about the practical side of it for a moment, because that's usually the part these stories skip. A hobbit's stride is short. A pass that takes a man a week to cross takes a hobbit noticeably longer, which means more nights exposed on open rock, more meals stretched thinner, more chances for weather to turn before shelter is anywhere close. They weren't equipped for it the way soldiers or rangers might have been. No cold weather gear built for mountain travel, no experience reading a storm front rolling in over stone. What they had was numbers, patience, and whatever they could carry on their own backs. That combination got them through. It didn't get everyone through. And crossing the mountains, brutal as it was, turned out to be only the first test. What waited on the other side wasn't relief. It was a slower, colder version of the same problem. The hobbits who made it into Eriador didn't arrive into empty land. They arrived into the shadow of a kingdom already collapsing under its own weight, the North Kingdom of Arnor, splintering apart under pressure from Angmar, ruled by a figure history would later know as the Witch King. This was centuries before he ever wore the title Lord of the Nazgul in the war everyone remembers. Here, in these early centuries, he was simply the reason an entire kingdom to the north kept losing ground, year after year, war after war. Hobbits weren't targets in that conflict. No one in Angmar was hunting them specifically. But that almost made it worse. They were just in the way of something much larger than themselves. Refugees caught in the path of a war they had no part in starting, and no way of stopping. Settlements that had taken root too close to the fighting had to be abandoned. Communities that had only just started to feel permanent were forced to keep moving, further west, further from the conflict, toward Bree and the lands beyond it. By the time the fighting in the north had run its course, hobbits had been pushed almost as far west as the land allowed. Bree became, for a long stretch of time, the furthest edge of hobbit settlement anywhere in Middle-earth, not because they chose it as a destination, but because it was simply where the pressure behind them finally stopped pushing. Centuries after that first crossing, in the year 1601, one of the last kings of Arthedain, Argaleb II, granted the Bree hobbits the empty country beyond the Brandywine River. That's the year the Shire was born on paper, a home, finally, with a name of its own. But a name on a grant doesn't erase what came before it, and it doesn't guarantee what comes next. They'd survived the mountains. They'd survived being caught in someone else's war. And the land they finally reached gave them almost no time to feel settled before the next threat arrived, one that didn't come from armies or ancient enemies at all. It came from the sky. There's a moment much later in Hobbit history, long after the Shire existed, long after most of this earlier struggle had been forgotten, where Gandalf, of all people, tells Frodo something quietly devastating. He says he first grew fond of hobbits during a winter none of them could remember. He calls it one of the worst pinches they'd ever been in. Dying of cold, starving in the dearth that followed. That winter has a name, the Long Winter, and it fell on the Shire in the year 2758 of the Third Age. It came without mercy and without an obvious ending point. Snow through months that should have brought spring, cold deep enough to kill crops in the ground and livestock in the barns. And when the snow finally did stop, the damage didn't. What followed was a famine that dragged on for 2 more years. A period hobbits themselves came to call the Days of Dearth. Thousands died. Not soldiers, not adventurers, farmers, children, the elderly, ordinary hobbits in ordinary homes who simply ran out of food before the land could give them any more. Gandalf's involvement in that crisis is usually told as a charming footnote. The wizard who liked hobbits so much he eventually sent one off on the adventure of a lifetime. But look at what he's actually describing. Not comfort, not charm. A people freezing and starving, showing him something he says stayed with him for the rest of his long life. The way they kept caring for each other, even while they had nothing left to give. That's not a footnote. That's a species surviving on nothing but stubbornness and shared grief. And it wasn't the last time the ice would come for them. More than a century and a half later, in the year 2911, winter came for the Shire again, this one shorter than the long winter, but no less dangerous in its own way. Snow returned in November and didn't let go until March. Food ran short, same as before, but this time the cold did something the long winter hadn't quite managed. It froze the Brandywine River solid enough to walk across, and something used that ice to come in. White wolves, driven down from somewhere in the frozen north, crossed the frozen river and began attacking the hobbits of Buckland. Whatever exactly these creatures were, ordinary wolves pushed to desperation by the cold, or something worse that Tolkien himself never fully clarified, they were aggressive enough and dangerous enough that Buckland did something it hadn't done in living memory. It sounded the horn call, an alarm meant to rally every hobbit in the region against an immediate physical threat crossing their own borders. That horn wouldn't sound again for generations. The next time anyone heard it, it would be for something far darker riding down the same roads. But that's a different story. What matters here is what it meant in this moment. Hobbits, the same people famous centuries later for a life of nothing but second breakfasts and quiet gardens, once had to rally an entire region against wolves crossing a frozen river into their own front yards, because the alternative was simply not surviving the season. Gandalf and the Rangers of the North stepped in again, bringing what food they could to keep starvation from finishing what the cold and the wolves had started. And once more, the Shire held on, barely, quietly, with no monument built afterward to mark how close it came. By this point, 3 separate tribes had crossed mountains that didn't care about them, been pushed by a war that wasn't theirs, and survived 2 winters that came within a bad season of ending them completely. And somewhere in the middle of all that struggle, without anyone deciding it on purpose, something else was happening to them too. Something slower, and in its own way, just as final. This is the part that answers the question the whole video keeps circling back to. You already know when the Shire was founded. 1601, the land past the Brandywine, Argileb's grant. What that grant didn't do was erase 3 centuries of separate history overnight, but somewhere in the long stretch of years between that founding and the winters that nearly finished them, the 3 tribes that had made 3 separate journeys started doing something none of their history up to that point had prepared anyone for. They stopped staying separate. Harfoots made up the overwhelming majority of that new population. It was their numbers, more than anyone else's, that filled the hillsides and built the first smiles in the ground that would one day hold Bag End. But numbers alone don't decide who gets remembered. The Falahides, smaller in population, but bolder, more outward-facing, the ones who'd always tended to lead, became the chieftains of these mixed communities almost by default. Families with Falahide blood kept showing up centuries later at the top of Shire society. The Tooks, the Brandybucks, families known for producing hobbits just a little taller, a little more curious, a little more willing to leave home than their neighbors. Store blood ran quieter through it all, showing up mostly in physical traits, broader hands, a comfort around water that outlasted the memory of why it was there. Within a few generations, nobody introduced themselves as a Harfoot anymore. There was no formal decision behind it, no council that voted to erase the distinction. It just stopped mattering enough to maintain. Intermarriage did what centuries of separate survival hadn't. It dissolved 3 peoples into one, until Hobbit replaced all 3 older names in every conversation that used to need them. Think about how ordinary that process was. No one sat the 3 tribes down and told them to merge. It happened the way it happens to most peoples who end up sharing the same fields and the same wells for long enough. A Harfoot family married into a Falahide one. Their children married into a household with a bit of store blood further back. And within a handful of generations, the labels stopped describing anything useful. By the time the Shire had its own thane and its own mayor and its own quiet little system of government, most families couldn't have told you with any confidence which of the three tribes they mostly came from. The bloodlines were still there, showing up in height and skin and temperament exactly the way they always had. The names attached to those bloodlines simply stopped getting passed down. So if the question is whether the Harfoots died out, the honest answer is no. In the most basic, blood and bone sense, they won. They were the majority. Most of the hobbits Frodo grew up among, most of the families that filled the Shire's hillsides for generations, carried more Harfoot ancestry than anything else. What actually happened to them wasn't extinction. It was something closer to dissolution, a people so successful at blending into what came next that their own name stopped being useful and eventually stopped being remembered at all. They didn't disappear from the world. They disappeared from the sentence people used to describe the world. That's a stranger ending than dying out would have been. Extinction has a story people tell. What happened to the Harfoots doesn't get a story, because there was no single moment anyone could point to and say, there, that's when they ended. It just kept quietly happening, generation after generation, until it was already finished before anyone thought to notice. One more thing worth asking directly. Why doesn't any of this show up in the version of the story most people know? Part of it is simple structure. The Lord of the Rings begins with a Shire that's already peaceful, already settled, already comfortable, because that peace is exactly what makes it worth threatening later. Tolkien needed the Shire to feel safe before the ring ever arrived there. A prologue detailing frozen rivers and starving families and mountain passes littered with the ones who didn't make it would have undercut the entire emotional architecture of the books that follow. But there's a deeper reason too, one that has less to do with storytelling and more to do with what kind of people hobbits actually are. This is a culture that, by its own admission, prefers books filled with things it already knows, arranged neatly with no contradictions. A people that turned away from difficult history the same way they turned their backs on distant mountains and old dangers, choosing instead to focus on gardens, meals, and the small, manageable comforts of an ordinary life. The long winter survives only because Gandalf happened to mention it once, in passing centuries later. The fell winter survives mostly through the memory of a single horn call nobody wanted to hear a second time. No one in the Shire sat down and wrote the definitive account of how their people nearly didn't make it. They survived, settled, and slowly let the harder chapters fade, the same way any exhausted people eventually stops telling the story of how bad things used to be. That's not a flaw on the record. It might be the most human thing about them. There's also a quieter irony sitting underneath all of it. The very trait that let hobbits survive everything this video just walked through, their ability to keep their heads down, adapt, blend in, and get on with the next season instead of dwelling on the last one, is the exact same trait that erased the record of how hard that survival was. The skill and the silence came from the same place. A people built to endure quietly aren't usually the ones who stop to write the endurance down. Every peaceful field in the Shire sits on top of a road that nearly ended before it reached that field at all. Every warm hobbit hole, every quiet garden, every family that spent generations doing nothing more dramatic than growing vegetables and minding their own business. All of it exists because mountains that should have killed them didn't. Because a kingdom's war that wasn't theirs eventually moved on. Because 2 winters that took thousands of lives didn't take all of them. Bilbo Baggins never thought of himself as the descendant of survivors. Frodo certainly didn't, setting out from Bag End with barely a thought for how his own people came to be standing in that doorway in the first place. But that's exactly what they were. Every hobbit who ever complained about missing a meal, every hobbit who thought adventure meant something optional rather than something their ancestors had no choice about, all of them were standing on ground that generations before them had paid for in cold, in hunger, and in roads that swallowed the ones who couldn't finish them. The world forgot where hobbits came from. The hobbits forgot it themselves, eventually, on purpose, the way people forget things that hurt too much to carry forward. But the road is still there, underneath everything. It always was. If you want more of the history the Shire never talks about, the parts that got left out because they were too heavy for a story about second breakfasts, stay close. There's more of it than anyone's told you.